In 2019, Minnesota's wetlands were dead zones. Cracked clay, zero trees, nothing alive, and every expert said recovery was impossible without $94 million and decades of work. Instead, authorities unleashed over 2,000 beavers into that desolation with no trees to eat, no water to work with, and everyone predicting disaster. Yet 5 years later, those 22,000 acres are unrecognizable. How did the world's strangest ecological gamble achieve the impossible? And could this rewrite everything we know about restoring broken land? Central Minnesota's drained wetlands stretched for miles, a landscape stripped of its original life. The ground was hard as concrete, cracked with lines that ran in every direction. Ditches carved by machines decades earlier sliced the land into unnatural grids, each one empty, each one leading nowhere. In the distance, there were no trees, no willows, no birches, not even a single bush. The horizon offered nothing but a flat expanse of dead earth, faded brown in the summer, frozen gray in winter. This place had not always been empty. Before the 1960s, these acres were woven with tamarack swamps and sedge meadows, alive with the sound of frogs and the flash of waterfowl. That changed when agricultural companies arrived, promising to turn wetlands into croplands. They drained the water, dropping the water table by 18 feet, then planted row after row of corn and soybeans. For a while, the fields produced, but the drainage worked too well. Peat soils dried out, oxidized, and turned acidic. Within 15 years, the crops failed. By the 1980s, the companies walked away, leaving behind a desert of their own making. What remained was a wasteland. The soil, once black and springy, became pale clay packed so tight that even weeds struggled to take root. Rainwater, when it came, rushed through the ditches and vanished before it could soak in. No insects buzzed above the ground. No birds hunted for food. Deer and muskrat avoided the area completely. State land managers inherited nearly 22,000 acres of this ecological void. Land that cost money to maintain but offered nothing in return. Every attempt to restore the wetland ran up against the same wall. No water, no vegetation, and no natural processes left to restart the cycle of life. Traditional plans called for expensive pumps, massive earthworks, and decades of waiting, all with no guarantee of success. The land stood as a monument to failure, a place where even hope seemed to have dried up and blown away. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a restoration ecologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, stared at the numbers on her desk. The state owned 22,000 acres of land that had become a financial drain, expensive to maintain, impossible to restore by conventional means. The latest estimate for traditional wetland recovery came in at $94 million over 25 years. That meant pumps, levees, and endless earth moving for a result no one could guarantee. Even the most optimistic planners admitted it was a gamble with public money. Rodriguez saw a different kind of gamble. She proposed capturing beavers from areas where they were causing problems, flooding roads, damaging culverts, chewing through private timber, and relocating them to the dead zone. The plan called for over 2,000 beavers, trapped and transported in family groups, then released across 68 sites. No supplemental food, no artificial water, no backup plan. The budget was $780,000, most of it for trapping, transport, and a skeleton monitoring crew. Compared to the traditional approach, it was a rounding error. The logic was simple, but radical. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, not just dam builders. When they run out of trees, they improvise, using mud, grass, even rocks to create water-holding structures. Rodriguez argued that if you gave them enough space and a large enough founding population, they could bootstrap the entire restoration process. Dams would slow runoff, water would pool, dormant seeds would germinate, and the cycle would start again. Beavers would cut what little vegetation appeared, but their selective feeding would leave enough regrowth to spread. Each new patch of wetland would provide more food and building material, accelerating the process. The proposal landed on the desks of state officials in March 2019. The response was immediate and divided. Wildlife managers called it reckless. Environmental groups warned of mass animal deaths. Fiscal hawks saw a bargain if it worked. Rodriguez defended her plan at packed meetings, fielding questions about animal welfare, logistics, and the ethics of using beavers as a restoration tool. In the end, the state approved the project. By July 2019, teams began capturing beavers from overpopulated watersheds, tagging, crating, and trucking them across the state. 2,034 beavers were released at 68 barren sites, with nothing but instinct and desperation to guide them. The experiment was underway. Within weeks of the release, the project's grim predictions began to play out across the barren wetlands. Field teams, armed with clipboards and GPS trackers, logged the numbers. Nearly half the beavers, over 900 animals, either wandered away or died in the first 3 months. Trail cameras captured lone beavers trudging for miles along empty ditches, searching for something to eat or build with, only to vanish from the record. Some were found collapsed from heat stress, their bodies hidden in the clay ruts. Others simply disappeared, likely picked off by coyotes or lost to starvation. The dams that did appear were little more than muddy mounds, barely holding back puddles that evaporated in the late summer sun. Every rainstorm undid days of desperate labor. By September, most structures had fallen apart, leaving behind only scattered clumps of grass and mud. When state biologists surveyed the sites, they found water pooled in shallow depressions, but nothing that could be called a pond. The surviving beavers huddled in makeshift burrows, their pelts patchy and dull. News of the project's collapse spread quickly. Local headlines called it a disaster. One editorial read, "Minnesota's beaver experiment is animal cruelty," echoing the outrage of animal welfare groups. Advocacy organizations filed formal complaints, arguing that the state had condemned thousands of animals to slow, pointless deaths. Social media erupted with images of failed dams and lifeless beavers, fueling public anger and calls for accountability. Dr. Rodriguez and her team found themselves at the center of a storm. Emails poured in from environmental lawyers, demanding the project be halted immediately. At a heated public meeting in October, critics lined up to speak. One voice, representing a national animal rights group, accused the state of treating wildlife as disposable tools. They said, "You sent beavers into a wasteland with nothing to eat. What did you think would happen?" The state's monitoring data gave little comfort. Of the original 2,034 beavers, only about 1,100 remained on site by the end of September. The rest had either died or fled, and the few dams that survived were described as pathetic and unstable in internal reports. The project budget, once hailed as a bargain, now looked like a waste. Local politicians demanded investigations. Rodriguez's team faced mounting pressure to pull the plug and admit defeat. As autumn deepened, the wetlands seemed as lifeless as ever. The experiment looked finished. Even among supporters, hope was running out. The only thing left was the waiting, watching to see if any trace of the original plan could survive another Minnesota winter. December arrived with a cold front and a sky heavy with promise. For weeks, the monitoring team had logged nothing but disappointment, failed dams, scattered beavers, and shallow puddles that vanished by noon. Then, during the first major storm of the season, the data began to shift. Rain fell steadily for 36 hours, saturating the hard-panned clay. Instead of rushing uselessly through the old ditches, water started collecting in new places, low points between the ditches where the surviving beavers had quietly moved their efforts. Trail cameras captured the change. Beavers hauled mud, grass, and whatever debris they could find, working late into the night. Their dams weren't pretty, just layered piles of sod and clay, sometimes reinforced with a single scavenged stick. But these structures, about 4 feet high, held together. Where before there had been only puddles, now there were pools. In some sites, what started as 40-foot puddles swelled to 250 feet across, deepening with every hour of rainfall. For the first time since the project began, water lingered. It didn't seep away or vanish under the next sun. It stayed. As the pools expanded, something unexpected started to happen. The ground around the new ponds, dead for decades, began to change color. At first, it was barely noticeable, a dusting of green, thin blades pushing through the mud. By late January, the monitoring lead, a field biologist named Karen O'Malley, brought in samples for analysis. Dormant seeds buried since the era of cornfields were sprouting. Sedges, rushes, even the beginnings of willow saplings. The water trapped by the beaver dams had triggered a silent seed bank, waiting years for the right conditions. O'Malley's field notes described it as a chain reaction. Beavers cut some of the new shoots for food and building material, but left others untouched. The plants that survived grew taller, spreading roots into the softened soil. Cut sedges and rushes regenerated from their bases, adapted to being grazed and harvested. Each new patch of green anchored the mud, stabilizing the banks of the growing pools. By February, the team mapped dozens of these fresh ponds, each surrounded by a halo of new vegetation. The beavers, once desperate, now had something to eat and build with. Their selective feeding patterns meant that not all growth was lost. Some plants rebounded faster, others spread from untouched patches. The cycle was simple but powerful. Water pooled, seeds germinated, beavers harvested, and the wetland grew thicker with every pass. For the first time since the project's bleak start, the monitoring data offered hope. The beavers had pivoted from failure to adaptation, shifting their dam building to the lowest spots and maximizing every drop of water. The land, seemingly beyond recovery, was responding. The team realized they were witnessing the first step in a process no one had truly expected to see. A barren landscape coaxed back to life by the instincts of an animal written off as doomed. By early spring, the numbers on the monitoring team's spreadsheets no longer looked like a disaster report. Instead, they read like a ledger of transformation. A core population of 1,280 beavers had stabilized across the wetlands, forming 68 distinct family groups. At the heart of the revival stood the Alpha Colony, whose main dam had grown to 520 feet in length, holding back enough water to create an 18-acre pond. The impact radiated outward. Satellite images from July showed that 35% of the landscape within 600 yards of any beaver pond was now green, lush with sedges, rushes, willows, and even stands of tamarack. The scale of wetland recovery defied every forecast. More than 7,800 acres, over a third of the original dead zone, had reverted to functional wetland. Where the water table had once sunk more than a dozen feet, groundwater wells now measured a rise of 10 to 14 feet across the region. Soil cores revealed a dramatic change. Carbon content near active beaver ponds had increased by 380% compared to the barren baseline. Layers of black organic mud were overtaking the old gray clay, signaling the soil's return to life. The economic turnaround was just as clear. In 2019, the land was a liability, draining state resources for maintenance with no return. By 2022, restored wetlands were valued at $5.8 million annually in ecosystem services, including flood control, water purification, carbon storage, and wildlife habitat. The entire effort, including trapping, transport, and continuous monitoring, had cost $1.3 million. The Beavers had delivered results at less than 2% of the price tag for traditional restoration. The monitoring crew, once tasked with cataloging failures, now logged success after success. They tracked the expansion of the Alpha Dam as it withstood spring floods, measured the spread of vegetation, and sampled water quality improvements. The data left little room for debate. The Beavers had engineered not just new ponds, but a scientific proof of concept, restoration at a scale and speed no one had dared to predict. By the start of 2024, the transformation was measured not just in water or vegetation, but by the life that now called the Wetlands home. The latest biodiversity surveys recorded 142 bird species, from secretive rails to bald eagles nesting and feeding across the ponds. Mammal counts reached 41 species, including mink, otters, and even the occasional bobcat stalking the reed beds. Amphibians and reptiles, once entirely absent, now numbered 23 distinct species. These numbers were not just impressive for a restored wetland. They rivaled some of the richest natural habitats in the Midwest. The beaver population, once feared lost, had stabilized between 510 and 580 individuals, maintaining more than 120 active dams. Wetland coverage had expanded to 10,400 acres, nearly half the original barren zone. Each dam created its own microhabitat, supporting a web of life that grew more complex with each passing season. Monitoring teams projected that at the current rate of expansion, these beaver-built wetlands could cover 75 to 80% of the original area within 5 more years. The results caught the attention of scientists and policymakers far beyond Minnesota. Neighboring states launched their own pilot projects, hoping to replicate the success. In Wisconsin, wildlife managers began relocating beavers to abandoned farm fields along the Black River, while Michigan coastal wetland teams studied the possibility of beaver-aided restoration in Great Lakes tributaries. International researchers visited to document the positive feedback loops at work. Dams trapping water, water spurring plant growth, plants providing food and building material, and the cycle accelerating. What happened in Minnesota challenged the old restoration playbook. Instead of rebuilding conditions before introducing animals, this project let a keystone species create the conditions itself. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the fastest way to heal a broken ecosystem is to trust the engineers that shaped it in the first place. Today, as climate disasters intensify and restoration budgets shrink, Minnesota's experiment forces a reckoning. Sometimes nature's engineers succeed where human plans fail. Their dams now hold more than water. They hold the blueprint for reviving dead lands worldwide. The question is not whether beavers can restore ecosystems, it is whether we are willing to trust them. Nature's solutions do not wait for our permission. What would happen if we let them lead?